Welcome, everyone. Nice to see a nice crowd, including a lot of loyal faces I recognize. My name is Vincent Rossi. I'm the coordinator of the Rancho Bernardo Historical Society Speaker Series. Happy to welcome you to this month's much delayed but finally triumphantly starting session. I was reviewing with Judith that this is the fourth date we've scheduled after 3 cancellations due to pandemic problems, but I'm glad we've been back. I mean, we've been back for a few months. And I just want to, first I should preface my remarks by asking anyone with cell phones to please turn off or mute their phones, as I just remembered to do belatedly. And I also want to remind you that our next program will be on June 11th, and the featured speaker will be me, speaking on my latest book, From Measures to Missiles, which is the story of the Corona Laboratory, which was a guided missile and other technology laboratory located in Corona, California from the early 50s to the early 1970s, which played a pioneering role in the development of the U.S. missile technology, as well as laying the foundation for a lot of high-tech age. So keep that, mark that on your calendars. So we're happy today to be able to welcome Judith Downie, who is the semi-retired Special Collections and History Librarian at Cal State San Marcos. I made sure and I clarified her status with her before we started. So she's been doing a lot of great work and has a very interesting topic for us today. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Judith Downie.
And it is so lovely to be here after nearly 2.5 years of delays and attempts and restarts, but that gave me plenty more time to continue to add to my PowerPoint and then delete because it was far too long. So I have lots of slides to show you. I hope to get through all of them because I have a tendency to wander off topic and share with you a little tidbit that's stuck in my brain. As he said, I am the semi-retired Special Collections and History Librarian. I'm actually officially retired, but I'm going back to work in September to continue my work on the Brew and San Diego craft brewing history. So I just consider myself semi-retired because yesterday I was at a beer-related event, and the day before that I was at a beer-related event. So I really haven't taken off and gone anywhere or done anything. But I do have a particular focus in women in beer, and so that's what our focus will be today, but you can always talk to me later about lots of other things about beer history, particularly in San Diego. A question I get fairly frequently is who's collecting San Diego brewing history? Well, the San Diego History Center does have a pretty sizable collection of what little remains, but they only run up into the 1950s. You know, Prohibition, a lot of stuff was destroyed because people figured nobody cared and it was never going to be investigated, or there weren't going to be breweries anymore, so a lot of things got destroyed, unfortunately. There are also lots of private collectors who collect things, either a particular brewery or a particular aspect of breweries, maybe a particular kind of beer. But unfortunately with those, they're privately held. You don't even know they exist. And so those are not things that are available for research. So what we're doing with the Brew at Cal State San Marcos is we're focusing on the 1980s to present, and you will understand why there's kind of a gap between 1950s to 1980s as I go through the slides. But we are focusing on the 1980s because that's when brewing really started becoming a thing in San Diego, and we are open to research for our students in various disciplines as well as the public. Now, unfortunately, we do not have an exhibit space yet, but if you reach out to me, I will give you my contact information. You can always come for a tour. Preferably set up after I go back to work in September, even though they left me my keys to my office and stuff. It's like, I'm retired, you left me my keys. Other frequent questions I get is, especially from other academics in beer history, and that really is an academic field of study, is what's up with San Diego? We have approximately 133 entities, which are brewing companies, active in San Diego County. That is more than many states. So we have a huge concentration here in San Diego, and I have a variety of reasons for that. But this is only the entities themselves. This is not counting all the various brewing brewing sites, because if you think of brew pubs like Pizza Port that actually brew at their business location, they have a variety of locations, so does Karl Strauss. So if you start counting places that actually brew, it's about 160 locations. And then if you add in all the tasting rooms that do not brew beer, but serve local craft beer, it's probably close to 200 locations in the county. So we are big. And that size, according to the 2018 San Diego Brewers Guild economic report that they do in conjunction with Cal State San Marcos, the San Diego region brought in $1.6 billion, with a B, dollars in revenue to the county just that 1 year. Now, of course, that's 2018. Things happened, and those numbers are still being digested, so I don't really have the most recent numbers, but we did take a hit. But we also directly employed 4,700 people. And that's direct employment. That is not affiliated businesses that support breweries, like farmers and shipping distribution companies and things like that. So we have a big impact in the county, and it's only going to continue to grow now that we're recovering from the pandemic, I think. Another question I get is, how do I get your job? Well, you talked to me about that. It's kind of a funny story how I even got this job, and you do have to have a degree in library studies and things like that. But my question, of course, is where are the women? 4,700 people directly employed. How many women are employed? The numbers are hard to determine. And of course, during the pandemic, a lot of women left the industry, throughout every industry and business. So I really don't have a good number on how many women are actually directly employed. But my question is, where are the women? And from my historical interest, I go, where were the women back in the day? And so that takes us to challenges in finding this kind of information. Scarce documentation. Prohibition was the cause of the loss and destruction of a lot of business records in the early San Diego breweries. We also have issues like stereotypes. Because of the common man regard for beer over wine or distilled spirits, a lot of it hasn't been taken very seriously by scholars until recently. There's also sexism in the industry, unfortunately, and there is also racism in various forms that really, turn a lot of people away from beer as a beverage, study of beer, study of brewing. But what can I do? Well, I research in hidden history. I research in areas that are being treated in a scholarly fashion, such as history and archaeology. What we're seeing right here, this is a 4,000-year-old clay tablet called the Hymn to Ninkasi, who was the Sumerian goddess of beer. She was not only the goddess of beer, she was the brewer of beer for the other gods, and she was beer itself. So she was held in very high esteem. So women have a long and honored place in beer history, but it has its ups and downs. I've also looked in fields that people don't even think about, such as science, such as chemistry, agriculture, food safety. There's also business, marketing, and economics aspect, because San Diego has never been a big barley producing region. And they certainly didn't have hops in the early years because hops were not even a North American plant. And so you had to trade, you had to buy, you had to order, then you had to develop varieties that would grow in this area. And then there's also things like political science and law. And that's where the best records probably are, is poli-sci and law. So I have research sources that are my favorites. Some are very easily accessible to me through the wonders of digital technology, and others I have to go to Sacramento, or I have to go here, and I have to go there to access them. Archival collections, such as prison and arrest records, are especially valuable during the period of Prohibition, because even though beer wasn't being brewed officially then, we all know it was. Genealogy files give me a lot of information about precedents and people who were related and people who were affected, and that's where I find some of my hidden women. Photographs have a wealth of information. Business records, of course, what little remain. Fortunately now, things are being kept better. Newspaper files are incredibly rich. Of course, that's taking into account that newspapers have certain biases. They don't always report all the facts. They might give you a story and then not give you the follow-up story. There are gaps in the records that I have to work around. Census records are wonderful, and this yellow line right here, Christian Doppler, is a name that we're going to be seeing again, as well as his wife Martha. You can see he was a laborer. This is from 1860. He was from Austria. She was from Prussia, which of course are now all kind of lumped into German. So he actually kind of falls into the stereotype of the German private collections, which sometimes I get access to, and I do spend a lot of time in breweries. Not necessarily drinking, but talking to people and asking questions and sharing what I know. So early San Diego brewing, I've actually broken San Diego brewing into waves because there have been big breaks in the brewing history in San Diego. And so doing that, I can see places where women have been and women have disappeared. So 1868 is our first firm date that I can actually verify where we had a brewery in San Diego. And Christian Dobler, that laborer we saw in the 1867 census, in 1868, he was running a brewery in Southeast San Diego, in the Cholas Valley area. So he named it Cholas Valley Brewery, but he also called it Dobler's Brewery. At one point he called it San Diego Brewery. He didn't really have a licensed name, which is part of the additional challenges in doing research in this sort of area. But he was definitely portrayed as the jolly German, because this newspaper article mentions that he, at the slightest provocation will drop a tip-top joke. So he was a very humorous man. And so he fits that stereotype of the German brewer in many ways. Well, in the 1860s, San Diego has a population that I think if you really, really stretched it, you could say there were 700 people in the entire county. That's not much of a consumer base, right, for even one brewery. But in 1870, Philip Whitehall, who was another German immigrant, opens up City Brewery in more the city center of New San Diego. I've seen pictures of the brewery. There is nothing around it, so I don't know how you could call it the city center, but it was there. And it was closer than Cholas Valley, which was probably 6 or 7 miles at least by bad road outside of what was considered San Diego proper. There are other breweries that you see listed in the research. They are not breweries, they are actually distribution depots for breweries from San Francisco, LA, and the Midwest and East Coast. They call themselves a brewery, but they did not brew, so I don't count them as breweries. So the most we ever had going in early San Diego in the first wave were 2 breweries. Now, how are the women involved? Well, both of these men were married, and unfortunately, health and just the times, Philip Whitehall dies in the 1870s, and his wife then runs City Brewery in partnership with Dobler. So Dobler is the beer king of San Diego. Well, he died in 1884, and Magdalena Whale, who was City Brewery, she sold off City Brewery to some men. Dobler continued to run Dobler's Valley with the help of a gentleman named Peter Clever. So there's our first woman brewery owner, is Martha Dobler, who actually owned the brewery. I feel that Magdalena sold it off so quickly she doesn't really qualify as an owner. But both of these breweries closed by 1888, and it was not due to mismanagement by the women. Martha actually sold Cholas Valley to a man who couldn't run it, and he sold it again, and it closed. I mean, just because you're a man doesn't mean you can run a brewery. And I don't want to sound sexist, but it takes a lot of knowledge and a lot of skill. And so both of these breweries had closed by 1888. Not that San Diego was dry by any means. We still had those brewery depots that were bringing in beer from other locations. So in 1896, we finally get a new brewery, San Diego Brewing Company. This may sound like a fairly familiar name. This is not the same San Diego Brewing Company, so I marked them off by, in 1896, we have version 1. This was owned by a German immigrant again he was a bank president, he owned a lot of water rights in San Diego County, a lot of real estate, so he was quite well off. But he died in 1905. He was not married, he had no children to inherit the brewery, so the estate sold the brewery to 2 German Americans from Chicago and the Midwest, named John Henry Zitt, who generally went by J.H., and George Stadler. Now, Zitt had lots of other interests as well, real estate and other things, so he actually based himself in LA. George Stadler was the on-site manager and the head brewer or brewmaster, and so he was the one responsible for the day-to-day operation, whereas Zitt did more of the advertising and publicity and things like that. Well, in 1907, they restructured San Diego Brewing Company to become San Diego Consolidated Brewing Company to reflect Zitt's activities in real estate. They also sold ice because they had refrigeration systems. They also sold glassware, so they were actually running a lot of other businesses besides just the beer. But they are the only local brewery that we have in San Diego. I want to call your attention to the logo from 1906. Notice the patriotism in this logo, the colors, dark blue and dark red, an American eagle, and then they incorporate the hops to denote that they are a brewing company. But I found that this is a very strong thread through a lot of breweries, is patriotism. They may have been immigrants, they may have been first generation, but they really pushed their patriotism, their loyalty to the United States as just one aspect of how they presented themselves to the community. But again, where are the women? You know, I'm talking about men here. Well, there are actually two Kates. Kate Lang Zitt is married to J.H., and Kate, who also went by Katie or Catherine Stahler, is married to George. When Zitt and Stahler first bought San Diego Brewing Company, they each owned one share. Each of the husbands and each of the wives owned one share. That didn't last long. Kate Zitt almost immediately didn't own any shares in the company. She may have just turned them over to J.H. to let him run them. But you know, when they restructured San Diego Brewing Company, they also started selling shares. They got it to where they had probably around 10,000 shares available for purchase in the company at one point. But Kate was never a large stockholder. She came from a Chicago brewing company, which I find very interesting that she didn't get more involved, but you know, there's almost nothing known about her. She was childless, but she did host extended family. She had J.H.'s two spinster sisters living with them for a while. She had her brother and her father living with them for a while, so she had plenty of things to do, but she seems to be very reclusive. The San Diego Society papers at the time, of course, that was a huge piece of news, as who was doing what in San Diego and what going to what party and everything. She's almost not in the paper at all. She's noted one time for a flower arranging board. You know, her choice, you know. And she, like I said, she held little to no stock. Now, Kate Stahler is a very different story, and she's somebody I would love to find more about. I don't know anything about her family background. I've managed to find her parents, but her father is listed with no occupation. So I don't know what his story was, what did he do, what kind of wealth did they have. Kate seems to have come from a fairly well-off family, because to own a brewery, you got to have some money. But Kate Stahler, I really don't know anything about her background. She was the second wife of George Stahler. He had two older children, then she had two children with him. She's very socially active. And the reason for that, I think, is because one of those two kids she had was a daughter of marriageable age. So she's out in the society parading her daughter around to all the other eligible wealthy mothers who have sons to marry off. And she actually succeeds. She marries them off into the, excuse me, I'm hitting things. She marries her daughter off into the Steinbrenner family, I think it is, who were a cigar-making company in San Diego and quite well off. So, you know, she did succeed in that, but I think that's one of the reasons she was so socially active. And I think maybe she was just maybe a more outgoing person. She did hold some stock in her own name, as well as George, her husband, being partners and owning a large chunk of stock. And then both of these women were noted for building expansion homes that would have been a signal of wealth in San Diego, and they are now both designated historic sites. One's in Point Loma, and I think the other one's in Bankers Hill. But again, you know, here are two women. Where are the rest of the women? Well, they might have been working in the brewery in the bottling line or something, but that would be about it. There are no employment records left. So where I find women represented in San Diego beer is through the advertising. Here we have your cup runneth over, and she's getting a big smooch, you know, gee, he's happy. Here we have the tired businessman, and his wife is bringing him a bottle of lager beer as a tonic. Frequently beer was pushed as a tonic. And of course, because Zitt and Stahler were German, and so had been Grundig, who founded San Diego Brewing Company, they are German, and so they do lagers. This one, I really would love to know the story. I talk about looking at photographs and images and interpreting them. Is she a fandango dancer? Is she dressing up for her husband at home? You know, I mean, hard to say why. She's got the flowers in her hair and the big full lacy sleeves and everything, but she is definitely pouring her beer the wrong way. You know, I mean, this is definitely going to be way too much foam in that beer. Then we have a patriotic theme, which again goes back to that trademark I pointed out to you, but still a large bottle of lager beer, but we have the laurel wreath, we have the stars in the background, but they still continually through all of these pretty much push it as a tonic, as healthy, as a family beverage. And then we finally have something that's only women, but you definitely get the feeling that they're at home. She's petered out. And her friend is probably saying, oh, well, get yourself some beer for a pick-me-up. So this is how women are represented. They are targeted as being the consumers or more the purchasers for the family, which is very important. So they do get attention, but their representation is still very stereotyped. Now, Zit versus Stadler. This is not George and J.H. This is J.H. versus Kate Stadler. George Stadler dies in 1909, very unfortunately, of meningitis and overwork, according to the paper. Well, he was running a brewery and Zit's up in LA, so who's doing the bulk of the work? But common to the time, the estate, Stadler's estate, is managed by male executors. Evidently, Kate was not trusted to run her own estate. But she controls voting of the block stock that's part of the estate. And this is an equal number of shares to J.H. Zit's holdings. So she can, I mean, if she wants to, she can block anything Zit wants to do with the brewery. Because he then moves down to San Diego with his Kate to take over running the brewery more directly. Well, Zit doesn't like that, so he contested her control in court, claiming that there was an understanding between the two partners that if one of them predeceased, the surviving partner would have voting control of the block, although the shares would stay in the estate for the benefit of the family. The surviving partner wouldn't be able to vote those shares the way they saw fit, which would be basically giving Zit complete control of the brewery. I have not been able to determine, because of the pandemic, limiting my access to going down to the courthouse and going through old records, as to actually how this suit was settled. But this is a newspaper article from 1918 that is listing Zit as owning 2,500 and 2/3 shares. Kate Stadler owns 187 in her own name, and then the estate of George Stadler, there's 1,937. So it looks like Kate has her own shares, but even her own shares, if she still has voting control, added to that 1,937 does not give her the same number of shares as Zit has. So Zit basically has control at this point. But it also shows that she has continued to keep her interest in the company because this is what's her, providing for her family. She has quite the interest there. Zit also had additional distractions at this point. We're talking 1918. What happens 1914 to 1918 is World War I. What happens in 1918? Well, we have the temperance movement gaining strength in California. California actually tried to pass their own prohibition in 1914. It failed, but it was very contentious. It almost won. But of course, Zit, as a brewer, is very concerned about what temperance is going to do to his business. If prohibition passes, he's got some problems on his hands. The WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is active in San Diego, and it is definitely women-driven. But the national WCTU allows every single chapter to have their own focus on what they think is important. And from what I've been able to find of the WCT in San Diego, their records, they were more interested in child welfare and home morale. Although they did have a committee on temperance, it was not a big committee and it didn't seem to get a lot of attention. So why that? I don't know. But also the San Diego chapter faltered. They actually closed down for a while and then reopened. So Zit had a fairly open field here. But I'm kind of wondering also if maybe this isn't one of the reasons his wife is kind of reclusive, is she doesn't want to get involved with the women's societies that are, of course, well, you're the wife of a brewery owner, that's your money's coming from this sinful practice, and I mean, she may have just been avoiding conflict for all I can tell. But it didn't seem to bother Kate Stadler at all. He fought back with various advertising. He especially tried to humanize it, showing the impact that temperance or prohibition had on his employees. They'd be losing their jobs. One of his sales reps up in Fresno actually got thrown out of his home by his landlord because he was selling beer and his landlord was a dry. So it did have personal impact. But then Zit also had the Mission Brewery to contend with. The Mission Brewery was not a competitor to San Diego Brewing Company. I said Kate Lang Zit. Well, her father and brother, the Langs, were from a Chicago brewing dynasty, and they had come out to San Diego and were living with her. They opened up Mission Brewery in 1913. They were actually heavily advertised as supplementing the production of San Diego Brewing Company, because San Diego Brewing beer was so popular, it was going to places like Arizona and Hawaii, and they couldn't keep up with production. So Mission was open to supplement the production. So they were actually a partner, but Zit still had his hands in this. Mission also made a beer called Hopski, which was a non-alcoholic beer. Because, of course, we have temperance. So actually in Escondido, there was an Italian immigrant who developed a process for a non-alcoholic beer. That's a whole other story sometime. So non-alcoholic beer was of interest in San Diego, but it wasn't a popular product. A lot of Hopski was sold to Arizona, but when Arizona passed Prohibition in 1914, they were successful in their 1914 ballot. They forbade the Santa Fe Railway to ship any, even Hopski, into the state. I mean, they drew a really hard line. It had to be 0 alcohol, where Hopski was like 0.05, you know, which technically Arizona saw as alcoholic. So Mission and Zit sue the state of Arizona and the Santa Fe Railway. They lose that lawsuit. In 1916, the Langs walk away from Mission because they can see how the tide is turning. Zit takes over as president, but then he chooses to sell Mission Brewing to a Mexican interest in 1917. Well, the Mexican interest basically closes down the brewery, sells the brewing equipment to a brewery in Mexico, and Mission Brewing, which is the building that you see down by the airport, that is our one brewing building that still exists from pre-Prohibition, is basically shuttered, although there was still some stock of Hopski because it didn't sell well in California. There was still Hopski available for purchase in 1918, a year after the brewery has closed. Who knows how good it was sitting on the shelf for a year. It's kind of scary. But the Mission Brewery building was actually used as overflow influenza hospital during the 1918 pandemic. So the building didn't just sit there, and then it became a seaweed processing plant for many, many, many years, American Agar. Then we have Prohibition, of course, passed in 1919. The federal level law was called the Volstead Act, but it did have exemptions for religious use. If you could get a doctor's permit saying you needed beer to calm your nerves, you could have beer. Or for a morale exemption for the military, even though the Army had a strict prohibition, it was still, you know, other services still used beer. So there were exemptions that California didn't like, so California passed the 1922 Wright Act, which basically eliminated these 3 exemptions, which basically closed down any brewing in San Diego whatsoever, because, you know, where are you going to ship it to? You know, you had the big Midwestern and Eastern breweries that were making plenty of beer to meet these exemption needs. But this federal versus state legislation causes a lot of confusion and enforcement issues. So, fortunately for women, they actually use it to their advantage. Because even though beer is not as lucrative as hard liquor, there is still some brewing going on, but women are generally not the actual brewers or distillers. They're more retail and couriers. And of course, you probably have all guessed that the term bootlegger comes from slipping a flask in your boot. Well, of course, you get more money for a smaller quantity of hard liquor than you do for a bigger quantity of beer. So pretty much beer was not, I mean, it was homebrewed. I've seen raisin beer recipes, which is, okay, you know, because actually the Midwestern breweries could still produce products like malt syrup, which could then be converted into beer, but to actually get the sugars to ferment that malt, they would put things like raisins in. So at some points there were bans against selling raisins. I mean, this, you know, it was wide-ranging, what can we say? But a lot of women did get into this illegal trade for compelling reasons. After, this is past World War I now, of course, there were a lot of American men who went across and did not return. So you have a lot of single women with families who need to support their families. There are not a lot of job opportunities. So they're having to make ends meet, and if they want to do something where it's not street walking, a lot of them saw being a courier for a rum runner or a distiller or, you know, whatever. They saw that as a way to do it, but sometimes it was done on the side. Also, women can take advantage of societal customs and norms. We have, whoops, not ready for review yet. Most dry agents are male, and we're not too far out of the Victorian era, so women are treated with kid gloves, even when they're considered criminals. they aren't frisked, they aren't searched, they aren't treated roughly, you know, none of this. And women can take advantage of that. Flappers, many flappers were rum runners. They had the money for fast cars, they're enjoying their freedom, they like to drink, and they would think nothing of going out and speeding down the freeway with the dry agents in hot pursuit, and then they would use their feminine wiles on the officers when they got caught. And other women could do that too, but here we have women are the meanest bootleggers is this headline, but then down further in the article, it says they're too smart for the male enforcement officers. You need a woman officer to catch a woman bootlegger. And that is actual proof here with Juana Ruiz. She was a San Diego bootlegger. She's described in the paper as a middle-aged Mexican. She did run a hotel down in the Gaslamp/Stingery area, and because her hotel was in the Oriental area, as it's called, or the Chinese area, as it's called on plat maps, she was nicknamed La China in Spanish. Well, she was arrested at least 10 times on California Right Act charges, because that was the popular legislation to use in San Diego. But at one point, 2 dry agents went to her home to arrest her. She distracted one by saying, oh, there's a bottle of whiskey in the other room. You know, why would you confess to that? You know, but she sent him off into another room. She convinced the other agent, while the first agent was searching for that bottle of whiskey, to allow her to go into another room to change her clothes, because she basically said, well, you wouldn't let your mother go to jail without being able to freshen up her clothes. Well, she goes in the other room to change her clothes, goes out the back door, jumps in the car, and is on the lam from the law for 8 months. So she took advantage of this whole societal norm of, well, you trust a woman, they're not, you know, we've arrested her, she's not going to run, things like that. Well, you know, yay for Juana. She may have also done it with the alias Juanita Casanova. This article here does mention that she served time in San Quentin's women's prison for perjury, which was a San Diego case, and that's a whole other story there. But the only woman I can find, I've gone to Sacramento and I've gone through the prison mud books, and then I found that they had digitized some of them, so thank heavens for digital technology. The only woman I can find that's from San Diego, who's Mexican, for perjury at San Quentin, is Juanita Casanova. And so I think this was an alias she used. I wouldn't put it past her. I mean, she's already been running from the agent, so why wouldn't she come up with aliases? So this is actually the mugshot for Juanita Casanova. And I continue my research hoping one of these days I'll run across a little nugget that will actually say, yes, this is the same woman. But it's going to be looking probably at non-digitized material through the Sheriff's Office record, because the Sheriff's Offices are the ones that actually enforce the Right Act. So yay for Juana, but she's a question I have to continue to clear out. So now we're finally out of that first wave of San Diego brewing and into the second wave, which I mark as being post-prohibition. Interestingly enough, when the Volstead Act was nullified, beer homebrewing was not legalized. Home winemaking was, but not beer. So we're seeing a discrepancy in how these two are treated. But in San Diego, we did have a Balboa Brewing open. It was the first brewery that opened up after Prohibition was lifted. But they were only here for a year, and then they moved to LA, and they changed their name to Monarch Brewing, and then they went out of business, which serves them right for leaving San Diego. Aztec was actually operating in Mexico under San Diego ownership as Cerveceria Azteca, but they moved into San Diego as soon as they could, so they became Aztec Brewing Company. Probably another familiar name to you. San Diego Brewing reopened with some struggles, but then at some point Aztec sold to Altes Brewing, which was a Detroit brewing company that was trying to go national. So we actually garnered national attention because Aztec beer was especially popular. Again, where are the women? There aren't any. I can't find any in here other than in advertising. And now, instead of being a tonic, it is non-fattening. And this is Acme beer, which was a big national beer brand that was very popular in San Diego. But that's the kind of representation I can find for women in beer at this time, which is sad. But San Diego, our brewing history in this wave starts and stops. It halts along. And remember I said San Diego History Center has till into the 1950s, and then we pick up in the 1980s. That's because local brewing ended in 1953. San Diego Brewing closed in the 1940s because the Naval Shipyard, the Navy condemned their brewing site on the bay for the Naval Shipyard. So that closed that down. And by this point, J.H. Zit's in his 80s, so he's really not interested in trying to move the brewery and start a new business. So that's just done. Balboa was here and gone, so that leaves Aztec, which has become Alta's. And Alta's just simply cannot compete against big beer, the big Midwestern and East Coast beers that were able to operate throughout Prohibition because they had those exemptions. Industrialization means making more beer in larger quantities and faster. That also has impact on the ingredients you choose to use, the beer styles that you produce. So basically you started producing bland beers, which the American palate then tends towards bland beers. I won't call it, what I hear some brewers call it. Thank you for the insult. We do have an attempt in the 1960s, I think it was about 1964, for a big brewery operation to be in San Diego called Great Western Brewing. They were looking to fund themselves for $500,000, which is like, that would be the bare minimum, I would say, even a small brewery needs to start today, and they had a massive plant. It looked like it was going to cover acres from the drawing I saw. But they were selling stock shares at $5 a share. So how many shares are you going to have to sell to get that $500,000? So they didn't ever happen because they just didn't get the funding together. In 1978, beer home brewing is finally legalized. Thank you very much. But it does have the caveat that you can only give it away. So, and a lot of home brewers are brewing beers that they don't want these bland beers. They may have served in the military in Europe and become acquainted with more flavorful, powerful beers. So that's what they want. And that's the sort of thing they're doing, but they can't sell it. They can only give it away to their friends. Which is, kind of unfortunate. But in the 1980s, we do see local breweries start to open. And somehow my last thing dropped off there. 1983, home brew could be sold, but it came with the caveat it had to be sold with food, hence home, brew pubs. So our very first brew pub, and I put that in air quotes, is called Fergie's. It was out in Fallbrook. It was not licensed. It was completely under the radar, and the informants I have who remember Fergie's tell me that he put a bowl of pretzels on the counter and said, "That's your meal." And because he wasn't licensed, he wasn't inspected, nobody knew he existed. Well, he wound up selling his repurposed dairy equipment, which is what he was using to brew with, to the first version of Volt Brewing, which Volt Brewing is, there's a second version now active down in the La Mesa area in Little Italy. Well, Volt didn't know they had to be licensed. They didn't know they needed any kind of business licenses or alcohol beverage control licenses or anything else, so they were operating without a license. Well, they closed when Chris Kramer wanted to start Carl Strauss's old Columbia Brew Pub in downtown San Diego on Columbia Street. And Chris went to the city of San Diego, and they're going, "Well, we don't know what to do. We've never had a brew pub." And he goes, "Well, what about Bolt?" And they said, "Who's Bolt?" And so that closed Bolt down because it was either go out, get the licenses, spend all that money, do all the rest of that stuff, or close, and that's what they chose to do. Because I don't think their dairy equipment would have really met legal requirements. So Carl Strauss, which was started as Old Columbia and is now Carl Strauss Brewing, they are our longest running brewery because they are active, but they are all brew pubs. They have never opened up individual little tasting rooms or anything because that wasn't allowed then, and they have held to that model. Oh, this is a very sensitive little thing. I gotta keep my thumb off of it. In the 1990s, we see an explosion of breweries, again, brew pubs, opening up in San Diego. The ones that are in red opened, operated for a while, then closed. Here we have OG's, which is still open, but I've given it a red asterisk because it no longer brews on site. They were originally brewing on site in San Diego. They have now taken their brewing operations and consolidated it out of the county. So they're open, they serve their own beer, but they aren't really a local brewery. Same thing with BJ's Brew House. They do not brew locally anymore, but they are still here. They are still a brew pub. San Marcos Brewing and Grill is the most recent unfortunate victim of COVID. They closed right at the beginning of COVID. The 4 breweries that are underlined all have women playing some sort of major role. Pizza Port was actually a pizza restaurant that was bought by Gina Marzaglia. She brought in her brother Vince after working. She owned Pizza Port, but she worked at Carl Strauss for a year as a waitress to see how a brew pub operated. Then she brought her brother Vince in to open up the brewing operation, and that's when they became a brew pub. So Gina is, owner of a very thriving brew pub chain here in the county. RJ's Riptide was founded by two couples, and I think her name was Mary Jane, was actually the brewer. So in the 90s, we did have a woman brewer. Stone, they did not open with women, but they have really brought in a lot of women, and right now they have women in the brew house, so I gave them a good underline for that. And their small batch brewer is a woman named Laura Ulrich. Rock Bottom, for a while, had a head brewer named Carly Smith, who has left Rock Bottom, and she is now on the East Coast running her own brewery. So we do have some involvement of women here in the 1990s, but it's still pretty small when you consider the number of breweries that we're running. Now, national numbers are pretty much reflective of the same thing. These are from 2018 again, but the brewery ownership is basically more than half just male. 2% are solely women-owned, which is pretty reflective of what we saw on that previous slide. Females employed in the brewing industry, only less than 8% are production brewers, you know, the women actually making your beer. 54% are the women, the people serving you your beer. You know, very skewed, and of course, this is going to be a much more lower paid occupation than being a production or a lead brewer or an owner, you know, although ownership sometimes you don't really earn all that much money. You've got it all in the business. So, and these again are numbers from 2018, which we will, there's a lot that's shifted with the pandemic, and I haven't really seen good, firm, clear numbers to be able to use those yet. But I'm hoping it's getting better, because what we're doing in the pandemic and beyond, which I consider the fourth wave, because during the pandemic, breweries were closed down for not a terribly long time, but enough time to put some breweries out of business. Women are making spaces and places for themselves, both in the brew house and external. And by external, I mean businesses that are affiliated with breweries. They do marketing, they do merchandising. Star Bee Ranch, which grows a lot of hops locally, is owned by a woman. And so I consider that an external business that, you know, who else is she going to sell hops to? You know, I mean, it goes to the brewing industry locally. There's also increasing participation being sponsored by the Pink Boot Society, which is an international women in fermentation professional group. I am a Pink Booter. They let me in. They said, well, you're a beer historian. We come, you know, you can in. And I'm actually a member of the San Diego chapter, which was the first chapter of Pink Boots, and it is the largest, but it is not international. There's about 1,100 chapters now around the world. Their purpose is to inspire and educate women in the industry to take themselves further in the profession. Locally, we have the Mujeres Brew Club, which is a Latina-focused, but not exclusively Latina, women-focused club for teaching women who have been intimidated about going into a brewery, because you get in there and you got all these people who know about beer, and they're talking IPAs and that Pilsner, and here's this barrel-aged, this. I mean, a lot of people don't know that language, and they feel very intimidated. Well, Mujeres is to educate them about beer, but also Mujeres has now opened its own brewery and tap room in Barrio Logan called Mujeres Brew House. And Sam Olson is their brewer, and she does dynamite beers. She's worked at a number of different breweries in the county. Carmen Favela and Estela de Villa are the founders of the Brew Club, and they are the co-owners of the brew house. They are the only woman-owned brewery. There are other breweries in the county that are, 50-50 women, or there's a woman in partnership with several men or whatever, but this is the only woman-owned brewery in San Diego at this time. So we're pretty much reflecting the national averages here. There are also brewing education programs. San Diego State, UCSD, Cal State San Marcos, we all have brewing certificates that have very different focuses. Maricosta College has a brewing program that they actually brew on site. Cal State San Marcos' program is actually the genesis for why I do what I do. Yay. Happen to be in the right place at the right time. And there are also national initiatives of various sorts to address things like diversity in the brewing industry, sexism, unequal access to education and funding, and there's also dealing with various legislation, because wineries are given a lot more leeway in their legislation than breweries. And that has been ever since Prohibition. It has been this commonality, And so the brewers are now starting to say, hey, if you're letting a winery do that, we should be able to do that too. But again, they're fighting that stereotype of the common man, the beer fights, things like that, where wine has always been more portrayed as, you know, richer, more genteel, things like that. So they're still fighting against a lot of stereotypes. But this is the fourth wave. I'm collecting basically in the third wave and the fourth wave, but my personal interest, of course, is in that first and second wave, again, where women are. But I do have interest in other things, so my work, even though I'm semi-retired, continues to preserve oral histories with, you know, brewers that I can, and people in the industry. They don't have to be just brewers, but people in the industry I can reach. Collecting things. In fact, this week I was, or was it last week, I was granted several growlers by a member of the audience, and I was at a homebrew shop on Thursday, and he said, oh, I've got several growlers, you want them? Oh, yeah. Because a lot of times, growlers, which are those large glass containers, that could be the only evidence of a brewery ever actually opened and operated. You know, because I've also found lots of people say, I'm going to open a brewery, and then they never do because they run into all the paperwork, they run into the expenses, they can't find a brewer, or, you know, their beer just isn't good enough to open with, things like that. But what do I do with all these things is I share and educate like I'm doing here, but I can entertain people in a brewery for hours with bits of information that comes off the top of my head. I do have some other areas of interest that I'm working on. Women's influence in beer styles. This is a glitter beer made with food-grade glitter, so it's consumable. This was done for International Women's Day, and the sales from that cake were used to help fund some of the Pink Boot Society educational scholarships. But I don't think a man ever would have thought of making a glitter beer. You know, Council Brewing which is closed, was run by a husband and wife team, but she was the brewer. And so that was what she came up with. So I'm very interested in that because there are other women-influenced styles as well. Cross-border collaborations. Here we are with another country a few miles away from us. A lot of our brewers here go down to Mexico, and a lot of the brewers in Mexico come up. A number of our beers, if you walk into a brewery tasting room now, you will see Mexican lagers. That's a very common style coming up now, which frequently is brewed with corn rather than, or with corn as an additive, which is a very Mexican recipe as opposed to, you know, the German lagers, which, you know, it's the rule of barley and yeast and water and hops. Thank you. I always forget about hops because I can't drink hoppy beers. So I'm very interested in that. I'm also very supportive, even though it's not on the list here, of our local homebrew clubs because, you know, Moharis is one, but there are others, the Society of Barley Engineers, Quality Ale and Fermentation Fraternity, Mash Heads. There's probably about 5 or 6 at least different homebrew groups, and a lot of those homebrewers do go into the profession. You know, they refine their skills in the homebrewers and get feedback from their partners. Oh, you're there. Okay. And then there's also the Museum of Beer in San Diego, which is an initiative that started fundraising before the pandemic and then went on hold. But they want to found themselves down in downtown San Diego, probably somewhere around East Village, and represent in an interactive museum beer brewing, beer styles, things like that. And they have asked me to be the curator of their first exhibit because Greg Cook of Stone has blessed me with 650 boxes of stuff. A lot of it is glassware, but also photographs and marketing documents and things like that. And Steve Wagner, his partner, has offered me his homebrew system that they brewed their first stone beers on. So I said, yes, I'll take it. And we just, you know, because of the pandemic, we've got to make arrangements. So there's lots of things for me to do, which is why I'm semi-retired. I just couldn't give this job up and having way too much fun. And I do want to thank you all. And this is even the guys try to be women once in a while. This was the Sour Wench Festival at Ballast Point back in 2017, and I just had to get a picture of my server, especially with this fancy sneakers on. And so I thank you all, and again, you can certainly reach out to me for tours in September when I go back to work. I also brought coasters of the Brew Hive, which has our URL on it, which will take you to the website where I have actually put beer history. And then this is a magazine put out by the campus that goes to donors, but it has a large article on it in the Brew Hive and the brewing program at Cal State San Marcos, so I brought copies of that as well. So I'm open to questions. Yes, sir.
What's going on in that mission building now down in San Diego?
Well, Latchkey Brewing, which was there, has left. The problem with Mission is because it's a historic building, they can't do anything to expand. So there's been Mission Brewing there, Amplify Brewing was there, Latchkey was there. There have actually been several iterations of Mission Brewing. There was one back in the 70s that never really quite took off. He was having the beer brewed elsewhere rather than actually brewing it on site. So right now I don't know what's going on with Mission, but Latchkey did not close. He just simply let go of his lease there. He put his beer and all in storage up in Orange County, and he is looking for another location here in San Diego.
So there's nothing going on in that building now, then?
Not that I know of. I mean, sometimes I just have to go drive around and visit things and check in on places.
So there are no tours that you could see of that building, right?
Nothing that I'm aware of. I mean, the building itself is owned by an organization called Mission Brewing, or Mission Brewery, something incorporated, and they have a lot of office spaces and stuff in there as well that are operating. And really, if you want to see the brewery, you can go up and there are glass walls, and you look down and there's the big giant copper brew tank, and that's about it.
What's the date that that building goes back to?
It was actually opened in 1913, but originally, here's a tidbit for you. I have seen illustrations of the building that had a sign on it saying Bay City Brewing, but it never opened as Bay City. There is an active business called Bay City Brewing now, but it is not anywhere related, just like Aztec and San Diego Brewing Company are not affiliated with their early predecessors. But so, from what I can tell, there was some sort of conglomerate that was trying to open up a Bay City brewery there, and they talked about naming it Panama Brewing in honor of the Panama Exposition from 1915. That didn't happen. So Mission was the one that actually opened in 1913.
Where's that located exactly?
It's, when you're driving down 5 and you look over towards the airport, it's the big brick building, and it does say
Before you
Mission
get off
Brewery.
to the airport, you'll see it on the right side. It's a big
Yeah.
brick building.
It was a seaweed processing plant for most of its life. It might have had some other business. Yeah, I haven't, there actually is a big commercial laundry near there, and that's probably what you're thinking of. But yeah, it was the influenza hospital, and then it kind of sat for a while, and then I think it pretty much went into the American Agar Company was the seaweed processor. And then they closed, and then a man named Michael Foote bought the building, and he wanted to open a brewery, but the only beer he ever did was contract brewed by another brewer elsewhere that I can determine. It's a very, sometimes you get these little naughty, you know, you get different stories from different things, and you can't really find the evidence, and those are things to untangle, like Juana Juanita, and this Mission Brewery period is another one that I haven't been able to fully untangle. So that's the joy of history when the evidence gets lost.
Yeah.
So, other questions? And like I tell you, I mean, I didn't bring any beer, since it's
Disappointing.
Is the building protected? Is it a historic building?
Mission Brewery is protected. It is a historical
So
building.
they won't tear it down?
They can't do anything. They cannot change the brewing system. They can't do anything to it. So that's why breweries come in, they get started up there, and then they leave because they can't expand. You know, I mean, the way you're going to make money is eventually, you know, the more you sell, the more money you're going to make. And brewing is not a high-profit business by any way, shape, or form. It's like grocery stores or anything with the food industry. You don't have a high markup there, really. And you had a question.
What piqued your interest into?
Okay, that's my story. You know, people say, how can I get your job? Well, I was the history librarian. I actually graduated from Cal State San Marcos. But after I graduated with my master's in library science from San Jose State, I left the campus reluctantly and worked at a small private university in San Diego that no longer exists. Right after I left, they closed. I not only destroy computers, I've destroyed 14 of those. I destroy entire institutions, I guess. But I got to come back to Cal State San Marcos and entered a tenure track job a couple of years later as a humanities librarian, which I worked with history and literature and philosophy and all the visual arts students and government documents and just anything none of the other librarians wanted was my job. Well, eventually, because of my interest in history, we refined my job down to I was history and special collections librarian, because we do have historical documentation of the campus when it was San Diego State North County and things. We also have a focus on San Diego North County. We've collected a lot of collections from various people in the county. So one day my dean calls me into her office, and you always feel like, okay, I'm in trouble, I've done something. And she's got this pile of papers in front of her, and she's got her assistant dean with her, and she said, what have we got on beer history? And I said, well, really nothing, because nobody's ever asked me. I mean, my students have been doing research in beer history. They've been doing, Chinese Exclusion Act and San Pasquale, they've done all kinds of other things, but not beer. And she said, well, there's this program that we're going to be starting for a certificate in brewing on the campus, and so I need to know to respond to their question about what resources do we have to support the class they're going to have on beer history. And I said, well, somebody's got to be collecting it. I'll find out, because the assistant dean is actually a home brewer. And they're saying, well, San Diego's just exploding. Well, I wasn't drinking beer. I didn't know. And so I said, I'll go find out. So I looked at San Diego State, I looked at UCSD, they were collecting it. I looked at San Diego History Center, and they had pretty much stopped collecting anything recent. So I go back to the two of them, and I said, nobody's doing it. And they said, well, you need to do it. And I go, you mean me? You're administrators, that means me. And so I went out and I started talking to a few of the local breweries and telling them what we were thinking about doing, and they got very interested and they were very supportive, and they said, you need to talk to this person next, because I don't know anybody. And I go, yeah, you need to talk to Connie Arthur at Lost Abbey, and you need to talk to the Pizza Port people, and you need to talk to Carl Strauss, and you need to, they're just reeling off names, and, sometimes they were making introductions and stuff, so I just kind of fell into this thing, and I am a collector, I'm a hoarder, I admit it. So, I grab things when I can, and I will tell you that the San Diego beer community is incredibly collaborative for the most part. They are creative, they're generous with their time, they're very interested in what we're doing. And that's one thing I tell when I talk to other professionals. I've actually gone to a conference where there were 36 presenters on beer history. Both ancient and international, as well as people like me who are doing very localized collections. And they all asked me this thing about what's going on with San Diego, because they all know San Diego's kind of the epicenter of craft brewing in the entire nation. I mean, we're called the capital of craft for good reason. And I go, well, San Diego's collaborative. They're not at each other's throats. I mean, I belong to a Facebook page that if somebody, they post, I need 11 pounds of some hop, because there's thousands of varieties of hops anymore, and they all have distinct flavors, and somebody else will come right back and go, I got you, man. Just give me a 4-pack and we're good. Or replace it when your shipment comes in and stuff. They do that all the time, and these should be competitors, and they're not. So they're very, very supportive of each other, but they all understand the hard road. Each of them is working because it takes a huge amount of money. It takes a lot of work to get your word out there and make good beer, because if you don't make good beer, don't bother. You're not going to have sustained business. But they've been a phenomenal community, and they're really encouraging of women, through the homebrew groups, through the professional groups, through the breweries themselves. It's phenomenal. So it's been a real pleasure to work with them.